Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today we're going to be looking at where ancient stories and historical interpretations, well, they kind of collide.
Oh, yeah.
We've got some pretty cool sources, lined up some excerpts from a religious apologetics ministry's website, a YouTube video transcript all about biblical genealogy, and then a really in-depth analysis of Genesis chapter 8.
Sounds like we're going to be piecing together a puzzle using all these different perspectives.
Exactly. So let's kick things off with Answers in Genesis. Have you ever heard of them?
Yeah, I've come across their material before.
Okay, cool. So for those who may not know, they're really big on equipping Christians to defend their faith, and that's actually a practice called apologetics.
Right. It's about providing a reasoned defense for your beliefs.
And you know what I found really interesting? Their approach to reconciling biblical accounts with all the scientific and historical challenges out there.
Yeah, it's a tricky area for sure. I mean, there are a lot of different schools of thought, even within apologetics, all with their own way of approaching these attempts to reconcile faith and reason.
Absolutely. Okay, now, switching gears a bit, we've got this YouTube video that dives headfirst into, get this, biblical genealogy.
Oh, wow. So we're going way back.
Way back. And the host, he throws out this question that just got me hooked, like, can we really trace the origins of, huge civilizations, Babylon, Middle Persia, Greece, Rome, all the way back to Noah's sons?
That's a fascinating question, almost like a historical detective story, right?
It really is. So he starts off by looking at Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons and their kids.
Okay, so we're talking about those really foundational figures in the biblical narrative.
Exactly. And he dives into how even their choices from thousands of years ago could have had a huge impact, not just spiritually, but on entire nations.
Yeah, like those stories about Adam and Eve, how their disobedience led to humanity's separation from God, or Jacob wrestling with the angels, shaping the destiny of his descendants.
It really hits you. These aren't just stories. They're narratives that have shaped cultures and beliefs for centuries.
They're the bedrock of so many traditions and worldviews.
Okay, so digging deeper into the video, it tries to connect these biblical figures to the emergence of something we're all familiar with. The Gentiles.
Ah, interesting. And where does he place that concept in the timeline?
All the way back to Genesis. He suggests that Japheth's descendants were the first ones to be called Gentiles.
Huh. It makes you think how much of our own sense of identity, both as individuals and as nations, is rooted in these ancient stories.
Right, like where do we draw those lines?
It's a question with no easy answers, and we have to acknowledge there are often multiple perspectives on these issues, even within different branches of, religious thought.
For sure. And this video doesn't shy away from some, let's say, potentially controversial interpretations either.
Oh, what kind of interpretations?
Well, there's this section about Canaan, one of Ham's sons, and his conflict with, specifically, Abraham, who was a descendant of Shem. The host argues that the land of Canaan was actually meant for Shem's lineage, and he bases this on interpretations of the Book of Jubilees.
I see. So that brings up some questions about land ownership and, the historical context of those interpretations.
Exactly. It's so important to consider these interpretations in light of, historical and archaeological evidence. We can't just accept one interpretation as the absolute truth.
Right. It's about looking at the bigger picture and acknowledging that these interpretations can be influenced by all sorts of things.
Agreed. Okay, so for our last source in this segment, let's switch gears again to this super detailed analysis of Genesis chapter 8. This is where the floodwaters go down and, Noah and everyone come out of the ark.
The story of the Great Flood, a classic.
Yeah. What struck me about this analysis was the attention to detail. It's almost like Noah himself was carefully recording each day, giving us this precise timeline of everything that happened.
Like reading a ship's log, noting the water levels, the appearance of dry land, and then finally that moment when they all step off the ark.
It's so vivid. But it's not just like a dry account of the events. It picks out these symbolic moments, too, like Noah sending out birds, first a raven and then, the famous dove, to search for any signs of life.
Ah, yes, the dove returning with the olive branch. That's a powerful image of hope and renewal.
It really is. And learning that in ancient Near Eastern cultures, the olive tree was seen as a symbol of life and prosperity. Wow, it just adds another layer of meaning.
It ties into this bigger picture of a world being reborn after this incredible destruction, a fresh start.
But the analysis doesn't shy away from the emotional impact either. Like, it really makes you feel the emptiness that Noah must have felt. stepping onto this totally transformed world.
Wow, yeah, just imagine that. The silence after the storm, the vastness of the changes.
And yet in the middle of all that desolation, he builds an altar and offers sacrifices to God. Such a strong statement of faith, even after all the hardship.
A powerful testament to his belief, his gratitude for being delivered.
And that's when God makes the promise to never flood the earth again. It's a new beginning for their relationship. But there's also something else that gets introduced here. These cycles in nature.
Cycles.
Yeah, it talks about seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, all these patterns that we see all around us.
Could these ancient stories about cycles in nature be hints about how ancient civilizations understood, I don't know, like prehistoric geological events? Maybe even offering clues to their relationship with the environment.
It's an interesting thought, right? Like, are we seeing glimpses into their worldview, how they made sense of these massive forces of play?
It's definitely something to ponder. These texts might hold more than just spiritual or historical insights, maybe even a window into their early scientific observations.
It's incredible how much we can unpack from these ancient sources. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. We still got those trivia questions to answer, remember. The connection between Noah's sons and the founders of Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome.
Right. Let's see how this puzzle comes together.
Let's dive back in. So it's fascinating to think those ancient stories, maybe they contain echoes of, actual events, maybe even shaped how early civilizations understood the world around them.
It's a tantalizing idea.
But before we get too carried away, let's get back to that YouTube video. Remember those trivia questions about the origins of, all those big civilizations?
Right.
Connecting Noah's sons to the founders of Babylon and Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome.
Ah, yes, the genealogical puzzle. It's time to see how he puts those pieces together.
Okay, so he kicks things off with Babylon. And he makes a pretty strong case for its connection to Ham. He points to Nimrod, the mighty hunter who's mentioned in Genesis. He's considered a descendant of Ham and a key figure in establishing Babylon.
Ah, Nimrod, yeah. He's often portrayed as a powerful, even a tyrannical figure, right? It really fits with that idea that even just one person's choices can have this, ripple effect across generations, shaping entire nations.
It really makes you wonder, how much of history is shaped by just a handful of individuals and their decisions?
That's a question historians have been wrestling with forever, probably. But let's move on to Medo-Persia. Where does this massive empire fit into this whole family tree?
Well, if we follow the video, Medo-Persia goes back to Japheth, to his son, Madai.
Madai.
That's a little bit of a winding path, but the host connects Madai to the Medes, who played a huge role in the Medo-Persian Empire rising to power.
It just shows how interconnected these ancient lineages really are. It's like tracing the branches of this giant family tree, watching them spread out and intertwine over centuries and across continents.
Speaking of spreading out, what about Greece? Any surprises there?
Not really. The video puts Greece, as you might expect, with Japheth as well, specifically his son Javan.
Javan.
Yeah, and he even pulls out this passage from the Book of Jubilees. Describes Javan's descendants dividing up the islands of the Gentiles amongst themselves.
Wow, so they were already venturing out and exploring new lands.
Right. And it really illustrates how these ancient stories tried to explain not only the origins of different groups of people, but also how they ended up scattered all over the world.
Like they were trying to map out the whole world using their understanding of family lines and ancestry.
It's a reminder that these narratives weren't just religious texts, they were also attempts to make sense of history, geography, even cultural identity.
They're like, okay, this is where we came from, this is where everyone else came from, and this is how we all fit together on this planet.
Exactly. It's a way of creating order out of what might have seemed like, a pretty chaotic world.
Okay, and finally we have Rome. What's the ancestral connection for this powerful empire?
This is where things get a little more intricate.
Oh.
Yeah, the host actually lays out two possible lineages for Rome. It kind of reflects the fact that Rome had a pretty complex history, right? He suggests Rome could either be linked to Japheth through his grandson Kittim.
Kittim, okay.
Or it could be traced back to Shem through his descendant Ashkenaz.
Wow, two completely different branches of the family tree. So how do we choose which one is right?
Well, that's kind of the point. It's like the video is acknowledging that history is rarely neat and tidy. There are often multiple interpretations, competing stories, all sorts of layers of complexity that make it really hard to find one simple explanation.
It's like a puzzle where some of the pieces might fit in multiple places.
Yeah. And it really highlights that we can't rely solely on biblical genealogy to reconstruct history. It can offer some valuable insights, no doubt, but we also need to consider it alongside other historical sources, archaeological evidence, all of that.
Right, like trying to solve a mystery using only one clue.
Exactly. We need the full picture, and even then, we might not have all the answers.
But that's what makes it so fascinating, right? Okay, so let's shift back to that textual analysis of Genesis chapter 8. We talked about that powerful symbolism of the dove and the olive branch. But there were some other really interesting details that caught my eye.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, the analysis pointed out something I'd never noticed before. The Hebrew word they translate as ark, it's actually tiva, and that's the same word they use for the basket that carried baby Moses down the Nile.
Wow, I didn't realize that. That's a pretty remarkable connection.
It is. It adds a whole new layer of symbolism to the flood narrative.
Yeah.
Just like the basket saved Moses from death and allowed him to, fulfill his destiny, the ark becomes this symbol of salvation, a new beginning for all of humanity. It's like this amazing parallel.
It strengthens that idea of rebirth, a second chance, running through these stories.
Exactly. And the more we dig into the language, the cultural context, the history behind these stories, the more nuanced and layered they become.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. Each layer reveals something new, another perspective, another depth of meaning.
Another detail that stood out to me was the emphasis on dates and timekeeping. The analysis really highlighted that the text gives us a super precise timeline, noting specific days and months, like Noah was meticulously tracking every single detail.
Almost like he was acutely aware of the need to document this monumental event. Like, this is day one of the new world.
I know. And it makes me wonder if this meticulous record-keeping reflects a bigger cultural value placed on time, even in the middle of this extraordinary event.
It's a fascinating thought. Maybe it reflects a human desire to impose order on chaos, to make sense of things, even in the midst of such a massive upheaval.
Right. Even when the world has been completely transformed, we still try to anchor ourselves to something familiar, something that makes sense.
Exactly. We crave that sense of continuity even when everything else feels uncertain.
And it shows how these ancient texts blend historical accounts, spiritual narratives, and maybe even early scientific observations.
It's that blend that makes exploring these sources so rewarding. We're not just learning about the past, we're engaging with a whole different worldview.
It's like stepping into their shoes, seeing the world through their eyes.
And in doing so, maybe we gain a new perspective on our own world, our own place in the grand scheme of things.
It's pretty amazing, right? How these ancient texts, they offer these glimpses into, so many different parts of life history, spirituality, even maybe like early understandings of the natural world.
Yeah, definitely. Like, when you think about it, those ancient civilizations, they didn't have the same scientific tools we have today. So their explanations for things like, earthquakes or floods or the changing seasons, they often drew on like myths and stories and religious beliefs.
It makes you wonder how much of their worldview was shaped by those stories. And, how much of our worldview is shaped by the stories we tell today.
It's like we're always trying to make sense of the world around us.
Like,
right? And stories, they're how we do that. They help us organize our experiences, understand cause and effect, connect with something bigger than ourselves.
I think one of the most powerful themes that's come up throughout this whole deep dive is the idea of renewal. Whether it's, the earth being reborn after that flood or the rise of new civilizations, there's this constant sense of things beginning again, these cycles of destruction and creation.
It's a theme that pops up everywhere, right? Across cultures, throughout history. It's like this fundamental human experience, this recognition that endings are often followed by new beginnings. That even in the face of, like, devastation, there's still this potential for, regrowth and transformation.
It's a pretty hopeful message, I think, especially in a world that can feel, kind of overwhelming sometimes with all the challenges and uncertainty. These ancient stories, they remind us that humanity has been through tough times before. We've endured some crazy events and we've come out the other side, maybe a little battered, but still standing.
It gives you a sense of perspective, right? Like, we're part of this much bigger story, one that stretches way beyond our own lifetimes. And within that story, there's this constant back and forth between, destruction and creation, loss and renewal. It's like the ebb and flow of life itself.
So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, what are some key insights or questions that our listeners might want to, think about as they continue exploring these topics?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is how important it is to approach these ancient texts, especially religious ones, with a critical and discerning mind. We've seen how interpretations can vary wildly, how cultural and historical contexts shape the way these stories are understood and used.
It's a good reminder that they aren't just like static, unchanging truths. They're these living narratives that people keep interpreting and reinterpreting across generations.
Exactly. And that process of interpretation, it's something we all do, whether we realize it or not. So as you delve deeper into these stories, ask yourself, what parts resonate with you? What challenges your assumptions? What new perspectives do these narratives offer?
I think that's a perfect place to leave it. As we continue on our own journeys of discovery, let's embrace the complexity, question our assumptions, and remember that sometimes the most rewarding explorations, they're the ones that lead us to unexpected places. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.